Part 30. Reuniting with Friends. Harry and I held hands as we walked into the Great Hall to make sure everyone was alright. We heard chatter as we noticed people were talking to one another and in small groups throughout the hall. Some of them were nursing the others, taking care of their wounds as we smiled at the ones that looked our way. Harry and I took a glance at each other, taking note of how peaceful the air felt, despite all the deaths of the ones who had fallen. We all saw as we walked through, including the Weasley family, who were all huddled together. I sighed as I felt bad for them. Suddenly, Minerva steps into view as she sees us and smiles. We walked toward her as she exclaimed, "Potter, Paige." I saw Harry smile as she hugged him. She lightly touches his face as they look at each other, and she turns and looks at me. "Paige, dear," she stated, smiling at me. "Hi, Mom," I responded as I smiled and we hugged tightly. She touched my face as she looked at me and I looked at her. I knew she saw us holding hands and she flashed me a grin, probably guessing what occurred. "We'll talk more later, dear." I nodded my head and smiled as she turned and walked away. I looked at Harry as he also knew that she was glad we were both fine and alive. We noticed Uncle Abe sitting with Oliver Wood as he looked over at Harry and nodded his head and looked at me and lightly smiled. Seeing everyone gathered together like this felt good. I nudged Harry's arm, seeing Hagrid ahead as he stayed behind while Harry walked towards him. Hagrid saw him, and I could see tears in his eyes. Neither say a word as Hagrid wraps him up in a big tight hug. Harry let go as Hagrid looked and saw me as he smiled. I went up to him with a smile, feeling him hug me tightly too. I looked up as he said, "Glad to see you doing just fine, Paige." "You too, Hagrid." He let me go as Harry and I watched him walk away. We turned around and saw Hermione and Ron in the doorway. I walked up to them and hugged Hermione as Ron hugged me from behind. "I'm glad to see you both," I muttered. "Us too," they said in sync. I looked at Ron as we let go. "I got to remember to thank your mom, Ron. She saved my life earlier as I was almost blasted by a Death Eater from behind during the fight." He didn't respond but simply smiled and nodded his head. The four of us started to walk out of the castle as I took in a deep breath of the outside air. I looked up into the sky, almost wanting to curse it, as I felt tears brewing in them. The two people closest to me are gone. I felt Harry grab my hand as I stopped walking, feeling like my lungs were about to collapse as I bent over. Paige, are you alright?" Hermione asked. I nodded my head with tears on the verge of spilling. "I just need to catch my breath, that's all." "What is it, Paige?" Ron asked. Harry looked, not saying anything, but looked at me as I stood up to see if I would say anything. Harry, Ron, and Hermione looked at me with a single tear from both eyes falling down my face. Hermione looked at me with sadness. "I'm sorry, Paige. I really am." Ron stated, "Look, Paige, we may not have always been in agreement or liked him, but I know you really cared for him. For him and your dad, I'm sorry." I sniffled as Ron, Hermione, and Harry softly smiled at me, which made me smile. "We'll always be around for you, Paige, no matter what," Hermione chipped in. "You haven't lost everyone." I smiled as I knew that Hermione must have sensed or knew from knowing me too well to immediately say that. We continued to the viaduct as me and Harry held hands and Hermione glanced, mouthing, "About time." I couldn't help but chuckle as Harry let go of my hand and glanced back at the castle for a brief moment. I stood briefly behind Harry as Ron and Hermione stood behind me together. "There's one thing I don't understand," Ron started to say. I couldn't say, "One thing?" Hermione lightly giggled as she looked at Harry. "Why didn't it work for him? The Elder Wand." I looked at Harry as he looked at me, and I nodded my head. "Because it belongs to another." Hermione and Ron just look at him as if they want him to explain. So he does further. I sighed silently as I held a breath. See, when he killed Snape, he thought the wand would become his. But the thing is, it never belonged to Snape. I noticed he was messing with the wand in his hand. I nodded my head for Harry to come clean to let them in with what we both knew. With Hermione and Ron still staring, he looked at the wand as he continued. It was Draco who disarmed Dumbledore that night in the astronomy tower. From that moment on, the wand answered to him. Until the other night, when I disarmed Draco. Harry looks up at us as Ron says, But that means... Harry nods his head. It's mine. As Harry was staring at the wand, I had a feeling about what he was going to do. What do you reckon we should do with it? Ron asked. Hermione immediately said, We? He responded, I'm just saying, that's the Elder Wand. It's the most powerful bloody wand in the world. I glanced back at them to see Hermione stopping Ron from saying anything more as I turned back at Harry. I watched him look down at the wand, stunning it with his hand. Harry, what are you going to do? I asked. All of us closely watched Harry and his movements. We watched as he took the wand in his hands and snapped it in two. My eyes got wide as I hung my mouth open. I looked back to see Ron was stunned and Hermione was a little surprised. Harry smiled as he turned and threw each half of the pieces of the wand over the viaduct. I had a feeling that's what he thought of doing. I stood there as Hermione and Ron walked to the edge, and we all stared into the distance. Harry walked by my side and entwined my hand with his as Hermione stood next to me and grabbed my hand, followed by Ron going by Hermione's side and grabbing her hand. We looked at one another as I sighed. With all of our hands intertwined, we sighed as we peered out into the distance, just watching peacefully. A little later afterwards, I saw Mrs. Weasley by the Great Hall entrance with the family as I called and waved to get her attention. She saw me as I walked towards her, neither of us saying a word. She wrapped her arms around me and hugged me tight as I hugged her back. I could feel how upset she was, and she was trying to hide her puffy eyes and be strong. I felt so bad. I looked at her as she smiled softly at me. I'm so sorry about Fred, Mrs. Weasley. He was a wonderful person and a great friend. Oh, thank you, dear. You were good and kind to him. I smiled softly. I can't even begin to say thank you for saving my life earlier. Thank you, truly. It's no trouble, dear. We have to look out for each other, don't we? Yes, I suppose so. Honestly, she's another one that treats me like a mother. She's so caring. You know I have to look out for you, dear, she stated. I calmly smiled as I could tell what she wanted to ask, but didn't want to intrude. Before she can ask, I said, It's going to take some time for me is all, Mrs. Weasley. She nodded her head and held my face with her hands. You know we're always around if you need someone, Paige. You know you are family, no matter what. I know, I responded with a smile. Where are you going to stay, dear, after this? She removed her hands from my face as I responded. Back home, most likely. My dad left his private home to me as well, so it's mine now. I think Harry might come and stay with me, too. She smiled kindly, hinting at what I was partly saying, knowing me and Harry were an item. Well, the doors are always open and welcome for you and Harry, any time, dear. As for the details on Fred, I'll make sure you and Harry know. Thanks, Mrs. Weasley. I'll remember that, and I'm sure Harry knows too. Please take care of yourself, dear. I will, I promise. We exchanged a smile, and I watched her walk away. I walked around looking for Harry, and after a couple minutes, I found him outside in the courtyard. Who were you with? He asked curiously. Mrs. Weasley. That's why I asked Ron if he knew where she was. He didn't respond, but nodded his head. I sighed and looked up at the sky for a moment, but I looked at Harry as he looked at me, knowing what I was going to ask. Snape's body? He questioned. I nodded my head. Let's talk to McGonagall and see what she thinks." Harry nodded in agreement as we went to find her, and Lord knows I'm not prepared for this.